Okay then gang, so in the last lesson we used an HTMX attribute to send a GET request to the server when we click on this button, and the server then responds with an HTML template which currently just bulldozes its way right into this button right here when it gets to the browser, and it replaces the text currently inside the button. Now this is obviously not the behavior that we want, but it does highlight the default behavior of HTMX when we make these requests and get HTML responses, and that default behavior is that the returned HTML snippet gets swapped into whatever element triggered the request and replaces whatever HTML or content was already inside that element. In our case, the button triggered the request, so the response HTML gets swapped into the button element to replace the text already inside there. So that's the default behavior of HTMX, and in some cases that might be okay, but in a lot of cases, like in our example, we don't really want that. Unfortunately, we can specify how and where we'd like the returned HTML to be output in the browser. The way we do that is by using a couple of different HTMX attributes on this button element. The first attribute we can use is one called HXSwap, and setting that equal to something. And this tells HTMX how to swap the content with whatever element the content is swapping with. Now, in our case, the button is the element in which the content gets swapped into, and by default, it's the inner HTML of the element which gets swapped. So it replaces the text inside the button, the inner HTML. So if I wrote inner HTML here as the value to HXSwap, then we wouldn't see any change in the behavior because this is the default value and the default behavior. But we could change this to outer HTML, for example, and that would do something different. And what that would do is, instead of the response HTML replacing the content inside the element, it would replace the entire element itself. So it would replace, in this example, the entire button. So I'm going to try this now, and you can see we've got DevTools open so we can see where the button is, and so we can see what happens to that when we get the HTML response. I'm going to click on this, and already it looks loads better. Inside the book list div, you can see now we no longer have the button, and it's been completely replaced with that UL tag and the li tags inside it. Okay? So we've seen how we can use this HXSwap attribute now to change how the returned HTML gets swapped into the element, but what if we want to output the content in a completely different place on the page? For example, inside the book list div right here. Well, if we wanted to do that, we'd need to use an attribute called HXTarget. And HXTarget allows us to specify a location in the HTML where we want the response HTML to be output. Now, as a value, we just need to use a CSS selector to outline where we want the new content to be injected. So I could say .booklist. Now then, as it stands, we're saying the target of the new content is the booklist div with this class, and the swap strategy, as it's known, is the outer HTML. And this means take the HTML response and swap the target's entire HTML with that response, the outer HTML, right? So it's going to swap all of this div completely with the new HTML content. Now, I don't want it to do that, so I'm going to change it. And I'm going to change it to be before end. And now what this says is find the target element, the book list div, and then inject the new content right before the end tag of that target. So that would be right underneath this button before the closing tag, right? So let's give this a whirl. All right, so again, in the browser, let's open up the book list right here and see this button. I'm going to click on show books, and this time the button stays because that is no longer the target. We're no longer replacing that. Instead, we specified this to be the target, and we said put it before the end, so before the closing tag, and that's where we see it right here, below the button, but before the closing tag of the div. All right. Okay, so now we're getting somewhere with these two attributes, and there's actually a bunch of different values we can use for both of these things. For example, we could use after end for HXSwap instead of before end, and what that would do is inject the new HTML content after the closing tag of the target element, the div in this case. There's others too, like before begin and after begin, or none if you don't actually want to use the response content. For our application, I want to stick with inner HTML because when we get the response back, I want it to replace the entire inner HTML inside this div, including the button, because once we've clicked it and we've got that HTML response, we don't need to click it again, we can replace it. Now, since inner HTML is the default value, I can actually remove this attribute and it's still going to replace all of the inner HTML of the tag element, the book list div. Also, we can use special keywords within the tag attribute too, as well as a CSS selector. For example, I could replace this with closest, then a space, then a div. And that says find the closest parent element, which is a div, and make that the target. So it works its way up the tree, okay? So that would still be the same book list div that we're targeting. We're just specifying that in a different way now. There's also other keywords that we can use here, like find or next or previous, all in conjunction with some kind of selector to help you target different elements. And the HTMX docs are a great place to look if you want to experiment with all of those different keywords. For now, let's try this out one more time in a browser. So then we can see the button right here inside the book list div. That's going to get replaced in a moment because we're replacing the entire inner HTML of the book list, right? So let's show the books. And now we can see those books and you can see the content inside the book list div is just that list now. Awesome.